Jerusalem, 33 AD. A man known as Jesus of Nazareth is condemned to death. The charge? Blasphemy and treason. The execution? Roman crucifixion. The cruelest form of punishment in the ancient world. But was this a justified execution, or the greatest miscarriage of justice in history? Today, we're reopening the case, uncovering the evidence, and asking, who was really responsible for Jesus' death? And perhaps the biggest question of all, why did he willingly go to the cross?
This is the Grace in the Gray podcast, and it's not a normal episode, if you couldn't tell by that fantastic intro. I'm so pumped about this episode based off of that intro, and I couldn't have a better team. So, Ben, thank you for the intro.
Absolutely. Thanks for giving me the opportunity.
And James, you're joining us in the conversation.
Yeah, I was going to say, and I'm Brit, but it's a niche joke.
I think it'll play with a surprisingly large number of people. No.
So yeah, this episode is much different than what we normally do. We usually take the black and white of Scripture and use it to speak truth into the gray areas of culture. I would argue that the topic that we're discussing today is not a gray area, but maybe you think it is. So hopefully this podcast might open your eyes or even change your mind. So I want to get started with our first segment in this true crime investigation, and it's the arrest of Jesus. So the arrest of Jesus, was it a setup or was it a legitimate charge? What do y'all think?
All right, so first, in order to answer that, we have to kind of establish what the charges are in my mind. So let's spend a minute doing that. So,
or maybe even starting with who was Jesus?
Yeah, okay. We can go even further back. And this is in all seriousness, though it's going to sound like I'm making a joke. In order to really understand what's going on at the time of Jesus' birth, his ministry, and his trial, death, resurrection, all of that stuff. Spoilers, I apologize. You almost have to go back like 400 or 500 years before Jesus is born.
How much time do we have today, guys?
Yeah, hopefully hours and hours, right? No, but just to give like maybe a little bit of quick background, just to explain a bit more about what's going on culturally and politically, because that'll come heavily into the story, especially around the issue of his trial, as well as what accusations are being brought against him. So the reason I say 400 or 500 years ago, before Jesus's birth, is because that was when the period of Babylonian exile took place. And the reason that's significant is because it's essentially shattered the Jewish national identity. All of a sudden, you don't have this unified nation under Yahweh's rule as a philosophical concept in the minds of Jews 400 years before the birth of Jesus. Then you have just this series of events that continues down that same path of fracturing the Jewish identity. So you have different things like... let me see, about 200 years of Greek occupation and rule. And then you have varying levels of like forced Hellenization, which is the Jews being ruled over by Greek forces and becoming more like the Greeks. Then eventually you have things like the Maccabean revolt that actually is successful. They overthrow Greek rule, and then you have the Hasmonean dynasty, which is these Jewish rulers, and then you have the Roman Empire come in, and there's this tenuous cooperation between the Hasmonean rulers, who are now they're not religious Jews like you would think of Pharisees or Sadducees, or no, not like Sadducees, because they're a lot more focused on brokering power and on maintaining that kind of tenuous relationship between the two. The two being the Hasmoneans and the Roman Empire. And then you have just the Jewish people fractured into all these different parts. You have the Essenes, you have the Sadducees, you have the Pharisees. You have them work together in a large council that's called the Sanhedrin. And then you have the Hellenized Jews that are still kind of adapting to or accepting of Greek and Roman cultures that have kind of come in as these occupying forces. So you have a very, very fractured group of people and a very, very tenuous stability politically. So that's the environment Jesus comes into. So that's a little bit of background. Who Jesus is, what you've heard is what's the truth. What's laid forth in the biblical account is that he was a carpenter. He was the son of a carpenter, born in backwoods nowhere, not particularly, what would you say, significant in a worldly sense. Obviously, we know looking back at history, he's pretty significant. But at the time, there wasn't a lot to distinguish him. He does eventually become a rabbi, and you could say he's a rabbi in it's called the peripatetic tradition. Peripatetic is from a Greek word, peripateo, which means walking. And he's a walking rabbi, right? You see him traveling from town to town. Another thing that you see kind of come to the forefront historically after the Babylonian exile, when the temple was destroyed, is you see the rise of synagogues. So synagogues are like smaller little temples, just in the sense that it's a place where Jewish people gather to exercise their religious practices. But that's a further fracturing, right? There was this one central temple in Jerusalem that all Jews recognize as like the sacred space for worship. That's where sacrifices were made, for example. That's where festivals were held. But then you have synagogues, and that identity is even further broken down into these individual locations from town to town. So that's a little bit of the background that Jesus comes into. And I guess now maybe we can jump into what were the accusations. So
I'd add one more thing to that.
Go for it.
You've covered some of the big authority players in this whole scenario. You covered who Jesus is. It's probably worth mentioning that everybody else involved that was party to how those things developed over those 500 years or so, they went through all those things, and the whole time the prophets are telling them God's going to set all this straight.
Yeah.
He's going to handle the problems. He's going to fix the problem for you. He's going to send somebody that's going to handle this on your behalf because you can't do it on your own. And they're all thinking, he's going to kick Babylon's butt. But it's not that. And then they're looking for it, which they're supposed to do, but they're looking for it and calling it over and over again, expecting something different than Jesus's actual target. Yeah,
and there's a lot of historical precedents for why the Jews would have been looking for a Messiah like that, for like a violent overthrow or a revolt. You have the Maccabean revolt that I was just talking about a minute ago, but even 150 years after Jesus' life, there were two revolts against the Roman Empire. One of them was led by a guy named Simon Bar Kokhba, and Bar Kokhba means out of the star, from the star, or something like that. And it's actually in reference to a passage from Numbers that recognizes this Simon Bar Kokhba guy as being a messianic figure. So they're not just saying he's great, they're actually saying he's the Messiah. And this is maybe 100 years, 150 years after Jesus has died. So there's precedence both before and after Jesus' death that the Jews in the first century were looking for that kind of Messiah, that kind of revolutionary character. And you do get a revolutionary, but not in the way that the people of Israel were expecting, for sure. Yeah.
Okay, so we understand who Jesus was historically. We haven't really talked about what it means for us today, and we'll get to that. But why was he such a threat? And what were some of the charges against him?
Yeah. So depends on what group you're referring to when you call Jesus a threat, right? Because there's all of these, what would you call it?
It makes me think of factions.
Yeah. And they all have these nuanced motivations for wanting Jesus out of the picture. And none of them are quite the same, but they all happen to line up for them wanting the same thing, which is a dangerous thing, at least for Jesus and his followers. So you have the Roman Empire, who has a little bit of a motivation to get this issue dealt with primarily, however that looks. Can't
you just like imagine a ruler sitting there and be like, deal with him?
Yeah, we need to get this figured out. In fact, we can talk about this more later, but one of the questions that you sent us was, why was Pontius Pilate so hesitant to sentence Jesus? He tried to have Jesus' case pushed back on a ruler from Galilee so that he didn't have to deal with it. He was that set on not being the one responsible for making the decision. So yeah, but there's a couple of different motivational factors for all these different groups of people. You have the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and they're both Jewish sects, but they're a little bit different in this sense. For the Pharisees, they focus a little bit more on oral tradition, and they believe in a physical resurrection from the dead. In fact, there's an episode in Acts where Paul takes advantage of the fact that the Pharisees and the Sadducees disagree on that, starts talking about the resurrection, and then while they fight, he sneaks out the back of his trial, which is such a good story that never gets talked about. He's a little bit of a trickster there, but that was the Pharisees. You can almost think of them as more like liberal in a sense, more loose, more accepting. And then you have the Sadducees, who are a lot more focused on like firm adherence to the law. So you can think of them as being like very conservative religiously, almost like fundamentalists in the Christian world.
So would these be the people who, if they caught you working on the Sabbath, the Sadducees would be the ones who enforce it?
Yeah, and that was one of the accusations that got Jesus brought before the Sanhedrin in the first place.
Okay, Sanhedrin, that's a whole different.
Yeah, it's not actually different. Go ahead.
I say that's like I don't want to say the Council of Doom, but that's the Megazord.
This is like the city council?
Yeah.
Kind of. It's so all of these groups with nuanced motivations form up a single ruling body called the Sanhedrin. So it's the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and it's like a local aristocracy, usually Hasmoneans, like I was talking about earlier. So these like Jewish lay leaders that are still trying to maintain this tenuous relationship between the Roman government and the Jewish officials.
Okay.
So that's all of those people. They're the Sanhedrin. So there's a lot more detail, but to bring it back to the original question, which was, remind me, Sam.
Wait, why was he such a threat? And then you started talking about he's a threat to these different groups of people for different reasons. Sadducees,
who see like a very strong emphasis on like strict adherence to the law, you have these episodes of Jesus doing things like healing on the Sabbath. Well, that's not good. So that's one of the reasons that they look at him as like a blasphemer or somebody who's stirring up trouble. For the Hasmoneans, he's just causing unrest. There's all of this tension between the followers of Jesus and the Pharisees and the Sadducees. You have these episodes described in the Gospels, like Jesus's proclamation of the 7 woes, where he says some pretty brutal things about the Pharisees, I think, in that case, but I can't remember. So there's all this tension, and the Hasmoneans want to keep the peace, because the more peace they can keep, the more they can continue to cooperate with the Roman Empire, so that they can continue to broker more and more power as landowners and as wealthy individuals and business owners and that kind of thing. So that's what they're after. You have the Hellenized Jews who are just wanting to keep the peace as well. They don't like that trouble.
When you say trouble, it makes me think of Jesus flipping tables at the temple.
Yeah.
Like that kind of trouble.
I mean, there's all kinds of episodes of Jesus kind of butting heads with different authority figures. So I was talking about revolutionaries earlier. He is a revolutionary, recognize it or not. He's always butting heads with these leaders. So let's see.
That kind of nods to the thread that I feel like ties all that together. Like you said, there's lots of competing interests and lots of different things. In my opinion, and there's some gray area in this that I haven't sorted out, even though the black and white's probably there. Status quo is probably the biggest question for everybody.
Absolutely.
You got the Pax Romana angle of pay your taxes, don't make me look like the bad guy.
Yeah, and you can do whatever you want. Yeah.
So you've got that from the state side, and then from the religious side, this is the gray area for me, that you have these officials, these leaders, people that are in authority positions, and you could look at that one way and say, well, they have clearly become consumed by the authority that they have.
Yeah.
That's one option. I'm not here to say that's not what happened. But on the other hand, they could just be super committed to the whole reason that they were there in the first place.
Yeah.
Because they had a purpose. They weren't there for no reason. But either way, Jesus either stood in the way of their purpose, or threatened their empty, hollow purpose. And there's, again, a spectrum there, and the truth is probably somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
But either way, that's still a challenge to whatever they were in the middle of.
Yeah.
They wanted to keep doing, and he was a hurdle.
Yeah.
He wasn't helping them.
Yeah, and as far as like the theological aspects of the accusations that were laid against Jesus, specifically, they were blasphemy, and that's not really all that much of a shock because of some of the things that Jesus said throughout his ministry that was seen, heard, and not appreciated, let's say, by some of the Jewish officials at the time. So you have Jesus saying things like, before Abraham was, I am, ego eimi, which is it's the Greek translation of what God calls himself in the Old Testament, which is Yahweh. So it's subtle, but
he's claiming to be God. It's not
too subtle. Yeah, he's very clearly claiming to be God. You also have, and it's not just the words he says, it's also the things he does. So you think about the miracles that Jesus did, they're called enacted miracles, and they're miracles that reveal who he is. And one of the ones he did was calming the storm, right, when the disciples are on the boat. That kind of authority over nature that's only God's, famously only God's, based on all the Old Testament narrative that describes who God is and how he relates to his people.
And not something that magicians could recreate.
Yeah, exactly. And even if that wasn't enough, he's also doing things like, performing the miracles in the first place, which is something that's going to draw a lot of attention and cause a lot of people to question the status quo, like we were talking about earlier. So he's pretty clearly claiming to be the Messiah. So do you want me to keep going, or should I shut up for a minute?
I was just going to say that, we wonder who stands to gain anything from his death, and it sounds like pretty much everyone who is not following him.
Yeah, everyone who wanted stability. Because if Jesus did nothing else, he certainly brought instability. And that's what was needed. That's what he promised. That's what he brought.
So you got more to add to that, James?
Well, no, I think I might have a segue into the next part of our discussion here, because the question originally posed is this a setup or legitimate charge? So I have pulled up here the transcript from Matthew from the trial.
Thanks to the stenographer.
Yeah. So thank you, Matthew. Which is laughable. Context, reverence aside, like just the way it reads. I have no idea what translation this is, but this is Matthew 26, somewhere in the middle of 57 through 68, where Jesus is standing before the Sanhedrin. And they say things like, they were looking for false evidence against Jesus so they could put him to death. So from the outset, at least our, air quotes, unbiased reporter here, kind of saw what was going on. They did not find any, though many false witnesses came forward. So they had lots of people come, and I like the way this reads. Finally, 2 came forward and declared, quote, "This fellow said, I'm able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days," which he did.
Yeah.
But it was at that point where the high priest are looking at him and said, are you going to answer to that? And Jesus says, well, no, he didn't say anything at that point. That's right. And then they said, tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God. And he says, you have said so. And they're like, well, why are we bothering with all these witnesses? He just committed blasphemy.
Yeah.
We got him, boys.
Yeah. That's good enough, right?
So the other charges, other things are talked about. And there's depending on which, ChatGPT or, whatever AI you use, there's either 4 or 6 charges, depending on how you want to break them out.
Yeah.
But, that's
what they go with.
Yeah, we're not exactly a legitimate charge situation to begin with, and then we get into the trial situation.
Right.
Yeah.
So when it comes to the trial, our next discussion is justice or injustice. So what do the historical records say about Jesus' trial? And you just read some of the transcripts.
Yeah, so the guy who James was talking about, who was the high priest, was a guy named Caius. And Caius starts to preside over this kind of informal, it's not quite a trial yet, but they're already receiving witness testimony. So that's kind of the process they walk through. They realize more and more they can't get him on anything. Then Caius poses that famous question of like, you going to say it? And Jesus does, essentially, or at least it's close enough. The problem is that Caius, as a high priest, doesn't have the authority to actually do anything with that admission. So the next thing he does is he calls like an impromptu meeting the next morning of the Sanhedrin. If you've forgotten, the Sanhedrin are these ruling bodies. So it's made up of a lot of people who all have different but aligning motivations to get Jesus taken care of in one way or another. And as I describe this, it's going to come to a conclusion for that question you asked, which is, was it justice or was it injustice? Although that's a complicated question in this case. So they have the meeting. They come to the same conclusion. The Sanhedrin comes to the same conclusion based on Jesus' words during that trial. That's good enough for them. They proclaim that he's guilty, but they cannot carry out the sentencing because at that time, the Sanhedrin was no longer allowed to carry out an execution. So they have their guilty verdict, but they know they can't do anything with it. So that's when they bring Pontius Pilate, the fifth governor of Judea, into the equation. He's a Roman official. He's the one who needs to sign off for them to actually get the outcome that they hope for. So one of the things that I found interesting, kind of doing a little bit of research on the way that the trial progressed, is that they're super aware of what they legally can and can't do, because you notice Caius doesn't do anything with the admission because he knows he doesn't have the authority, so he hands it over to the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin, in a formalized trial, gets the guilty verdict they need, but they know they can't carry out the sentencing, so they hand it on to Pontius. So they're going through like these processes so that you almost have this patina or this like surface level jurisprudence that's going on that's completely legitimate, completely ignoring, of course, and sweeping under the rug the fact that like from the beginning, like it's, I can't remember which. Who
are they afraid of? Why are they following these rules? God?
Maybe Roman officials, the same kind of people you would be afraid of
like
if you were
ups?
to break the law or to commit like some kind of miscarriage of justice.
Okay.
Like they want Jesus taken care of, but not in a way that could come back on them, right?
They want it to stand up, basically.
Yeah, yeah. So anytime anybody comes back and looks at it with any kind of like lens, like exactly what we're doing now, they want it to be able to stand up to any kind of pushback.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it has this, what would you call it? I don't know, just like this superficial sense of like justice and propriety about it. But underneath that, in the underpinnings, as Matthew points out, like this was the goal from the beginning. It didn't matter what happened in the trials. They were going to push for this from the beginning. Yeah.
But Pilate was hesitant, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like I was saying earlier, I have the name somewhere in here so here it is. Herod Antipas, who was a ruler in Galilee. And Pontius finds out that this is essentially what the Sanhedrin is asking of him, for him to sign off on and approve the foregone conclusion they've already come to, which is that he's committed blasphemy, and the penalty for blasphemy is death. But he doesn't want to do it for the exact same reason that we were talking about earlier, that a lot of the Roman officials and Jewish officials were wanting to get rid of Jesus in the first place, which is, maybe if I get rid of Jesus, that's going to be what causes the unrest. So it's this perfect storm of like, maybe getting rid of Jesus causes unrest, maybe not getting rid of Jesus causes unrest, because it's almost as if the life and ministry and teachings of Jesus have already set the unrest in motion. And what you're seeing on the back end is all of these leaders try to catch up and fix the unrest, and they're not really sure which way to do it. So Pontius says, maybe this isn't such a good idea. At the very least, I don't want to be responsible for the sentencing. So he sends Jesus off to this Herod Antipas because he hopes that he'll actually exercise the right that he has to be able to put Jesus to death. But Jesus doesn't say anything at the trial. He has no respect for Herod Antipas because Herod Antipas is the one that killed John the Baptist.
Ooh.
Yeah, there's some drama in here. So he says nothing at the trial. They can't carry on with the trial because Jesus doesn't participate. So they send him back to Pontius, and finally he's almost forced to do something But the thing that he does is
he kind of passes the buck, right?
Yeah, he does. So I feel like I'm just going. Sorry.
No, I'm over here.
It's suspenseful.
I need some popcorn.
Yeah.
Well, and for the record, for anybody that may wonder what that significance might be with John the Baptist, that's his cousin.
Yeah.
And it's easy to read over the scripture and lose the family connections that are going on there. And yeah, so if I would not want to be called in front of the person that killed my cousin illegitimately, but I also wouldn't want to be the guy who made that call, having the cousin come in that is going to stand before.
In addition to that, John the Baptist is also the one who was essentially the primary active party in inaugurating the ministry of Jesus, almost not passing that authority, because Jesus has an authority that can only be given by God, but displaying the authority of Christ at the event of his baptism. So he's a pretty significant figure and pretty buddy with Jesus. So yeah, that's some of the context for why Jesus has very little respect for Herod Antipas and does not feel any, because he interacts with Pontius, he interacts with the Sanhedrin, he interacts with Caiaphas, but nothing. I got nothing for you.
Ooh, that's so real.
Yeah,
it's so human.
Intense. Yeah. He is that fully God, fully man. And there's lots of different places, and we'll get to, let's say, the carrying out of the sentencing in a minute. And there's some interesting stuff there as well, as far as his humanization.
So back to Pontius passing the buck.
So first, I can't remember if this conversation takes place before or after. I think it's before he's actually sent off to Herod Antipas. Pontius wants to know and understand for himself politically what Jesus believes, what could be harmful about Jesus' life and teachings. So he asks him a question. He asks, are you the king of the Jews? Like, who am I talking to here? Are you claiming that authority? Because if you are the king of the Jews and I kill you, it's going to be very bad news for me as a Roman official, because I've got pressure from above me coming from the emperor to maintain this peace, because maintain peace means maintained income, right? You're still making money. War means trade routes are closed. So he's got lots of interest in being very, very cautious in the way he proceeds. So he asks him that question, are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus says yes, but then he's suspicious of what Pontius what Pilate may mean when he asks that question. So he says, but my kingdom is not of this world. Because he's trying to point out to Pontius, the way that you're trying to cast me to figure out if I'm a threat is not even the right way to be contextualizing who I am as a person to you. So he teases out that nuance, but it doesn't help Pontius, because that's even less elucidating than if Jesus just said, yep, I'm the king. Thanks very much. I'm in charge. Goodbye. Yeah. So he's even further muddied the waters, hence the further hesitation from Pilate. So he gets back from Herod Antipas, and Pontius Pilate is still not ready to carry out this sentencing, despite the fact that there are lots of people who want him to do it, for all those reasons already mentioned. So what he does is he relies on like a Passover amnesty tradition, where he says, because we're in the middle of Passover, you get the chance to kind of ransom one criminal from his sentencing or his consequences for whatever he's done. So that's where you have this famous scene where you have Barabbas, who is functionally, he's a terrorist, a Jewish terrorist, and Jesus. And for lots of reasons, Pontius would really love for this crowd to not pick Barabbas. Because if Barabbas gets killed, that's fantastic news for him, because he's a terrorist in the sense that he's a revolutionary against the Roman Empire. So he is certainly causing unrest, where Pilate is not clear on whether or not Jesus is actually a threat to Roman authority. So he gives all of the people that are present during the course of that trial the opportunity to pick between one of them. And of course, they say, Yeshua Barabbas, give us Barabbas. So
the people
Jesus
in the crowd are kind of like the jury.
Yeah.
But it's probably more than what we would see in a typical 12-person
jury. In this case, yeah, that
jury.
may not be typical, but because Pilate is taking the fact that it's Passover, taking advantage of the fact that it's Passover, he now gets the opportunity to almost take a pulse of the people who are there because he doesn't want unrest among them either. So there's lots of different motivations going on. He wants it to be Barabbas that gets killed because he's definitely causing unrest. He's a revolutionary. He's a terrorist. Then you have all the people who have very strong feelings about these things. And he gets in this single moment to possibly get one of his enemies taken out, but also to get a read on the pulse of the people that are physically there. So generally, the masses would not necessarily be officially their opinions recorded for the trial. But in this case, because he's leaning into the Passover amnesty tradition, he gets to do those things. But of course, they say, give us Barabbas, which is shocking to Pontius.
So do you think that they truly wanted to free Barabbas, or were they manipulated somehow?
So that's a tough and nuanced question.
Like, how
James,
do we really know?
chime in? Sorry, I'll keep talking.
Yeah, two thoughts. One is I've heard, Ben, you may know, Sam, you may know, that the physical layout of the place where Jesus being in front of Pilate took place lent itself to, like, there's an area where the crowd could gather that's outside the gate, but close enough to know what's going on, and also for them to hear how the crowd's responding to things that they are watching unfold in front of them.
Yeah.
So that's number one. So
there's some cultural pressure.
Yeah,
all the people gathered.
It's a tense situation all the way around. One thing, this is another gray area. I've heard this taught different ways, and I tend to actually lean one way on this one. It's Passover, so you're in Jerusalem, right? So you have Jews coming from all over the physical nation of Israel coming to this place. You also have people from outside of the country coming in. We also know from later on in some of the letters and things in Acts that there's lots and lots and lots of people that are not even of Jewish descent that they're practicing. I guess about to outkick my coverage here. They're Jewish, but they have chosen to practice in a Jewish way. They're not culturally Jewish. They're not like of the original 12 tribes or anything like that. So, so we have people that believe in God that are in town that I have to believe don't know much about what's going on. So what I've heard most of my life is at the beginning of the week, they were welcoming him as a king, and at the end of the week, they were, basically on
Crucify
trial.
him.
And so the question, the rub and all that is, the people at the trial, are they the same people that were waving palm branches? Personally, I just don't think it's the same people. I think you've got enough of a pool of people to pull from that there's not a lot of overlap. I'm not to say that there weren't, but I feel like given the amount of other legitimate pressure, political, religious, otherwise, going on in that town during that week, that you could have both and it not be an overlap in who was doing that.
So you're saying it's possible, going back to the jury idea, like were these people placed within the court?
Or they were just the ones that happened to show up? Maybe?
Right. Yeah, it could go either way.
We got plants.
Yeah. And then I'm thinking too, back to my own jury duty experience. In the room of the 12, I was leaning one way. By the end of the night, I had flipped.
Yeah.
So the whole, are they waving the palm branches on the first day, and then at the end of the week they're shouting, crucify him? I think that could happen. Yeah.
So that's one interpretation, is they're separate people. It's unknown, I feel, is important to say. Like, we're not given names of the people that are in these amorphous crowds, whoever these crowds are. But what we do know is one of the things I was talking about earlier, which was that there was a very specific expectation from Jews when they heard about the Messiah based on the Maccabean revolt, which was violent overthrow. Jesus comes to Jerusalem. That is not only literarily and narratively in the Gospels, the climax of the story, but even for those experiencing Jesus' life and ministry, they would have seen that as the climax of his ministry as well. So this is the big moment. And then it's a whole week leading up to his trial, his death, and he doesn't do anything. He doesn't do anything according to the people who had this expectation that he would be a revolutionary like the Maccabees. Mm-hmm. He's saying things to Pilate like, yes, I am king of the Jews, but my kingdom is not of this world. We're not about to have some kind of physical battle back and forth for worldly power. What you need to understand, or what you don't understand, is that I already have the power whether you allow me to or not. I've got it. So in that sense, I wouldn't necessarily be shocked if it was the same exact people, or even if there's just this massive shift in public opinion concerning who Jesus is over the span of a week as we come to the climax, the denouement of this entire story, and nothing.
Join us next week for part 2 as we continue our deep dive into Jesus' last week in Jerusalem. Thanks for listening to Grace in the Gray. We'll see you back here in 1 week.